Okay. So we're going to talk about ecology today. What is ecology?
The environment in which animals live.
So it's an organism and its environment. And that includes its abiotic environment, in other words, non-living environment, and then its living environment, including social environment. Why did you pick this chair and sit in? What? Okay, legacy. So, legacy. No, that's true. Why do people do the same thing over and over again? Well, they start there and why move, right? Animals pick their spots the same way. And they go back to the same space where they got food before. They've got a nest. Some people in here probably aren't sitting in the same chair they started in, because they wanted a change of view, right? So this is what I would call habitat selection, where you find yourself, or where an animal finds itself, or a plant, or anything else for that matter. That environment varies in space and time. If we were to come back here in August, the weather wouldn't be like this. It would probably be hotter than hell, right? So, it varies in time. Obviously, you could leave this environment in here and go down the hall and pick another one and just pop on in and say hi to the teacher, and he'd wonder why the hell you're there. But organisms need a place to exist. Now, some of them only have like temporary spaces. For example, birds during the non-breeding season, they don't have nests, right? They just kind of perch and go to sleep and then wake up. But during the breeding season, they have a nest. And they have a nest, they pick that spot specifically. Now, they're not necessarily thinking like this. Oh, I need a nice spot that other animals can't see. But through evolutionary time, they've learned what features their brain is looking for. Okay. Now, what we have here is a tropical reef. One of the most diverse habitats on the planet in terms of the marine environment, for sure. Usually found in tropical waters, but not. There are some corals, for example, that live in temperate waters. But for the most part, this is, who knows where this is. It might be Hawaii, it might be somewhere in the South Pacific, or it might be the Caribbean. Most of the stuff that you see here okay, so this is a coral, a brain's head coral. This is a sea anemone. Different kind of coral, various kinds of fishes that live in the reef or close to it. Other things like invertebrates, let's say crabs, perhaps octopus, cuttlefish, something like that. Now the coral have something else that's going on. They're involved in what's called a mutualism. Anybody here know what a mutualism is? Well, one species benefits another, and that species benefits the original species. Okay, so, and what I mean by that is that a lot of these coral have these organisms called zooxanthellae that are photosynthetic. And they live within the coral, and they make a number of compounds that are basically, we learned this a long, long time ago, carbohydrates, those sorts of things. And they have a nice place to stay. So the zooxanthellae has a nice place to stay, and then the coral gets some benefit from it in terms of, let's say, food supply. Now, the coral also gets a lot of its food supply from taking stuff, zooplankton and plankton, basically, very small types of animals and plants out of the water directly. So this is the coral ecosystem, or the tropical reef ecosystem, we'll say, in terms of what size we're looking at. So, not all interactions between living things are pleasant. For example, there's predation, there's pathogens and parasites, all those kinds of things. Those are plus negative interactions. We'll look at a little chart in a second. Hold on. It'll happen. Okay. So, what's the abiotic environment in this classroom? Anything? Huh? Seats. Okay. And biotic? Yep. There's other things in here. I'm sure there's probably some insects in here. You're actually an environment for a whole slew of organisms that live inside and on your surface. Okay? Now, would you consider human beings a social species or a species that hangs out by itself most of the time?
Social.
Right. So, one of the things that social organisms must do is they must kind of navigate the interactions among species. And I would probably say that your social environment is the most important one in your environment at this point. You have people in here, some of you know as friends. You might have a few enemies. There might even be a sociopath in here or two, who knows. There's all kinds of dynamics going on in terms of, let's say sexual dynamics, right? Males and females and all mixed together, all kinds of things can happen, right? And there's probably guys in here thinking, she's pretty cute, and she might be thinking, nah, not so much. That's an interaction. They don't know it, but that's an interaction. So there's also probably dominance hierarchies to a certain extent. Some of you might have higher status. Status is an important thing. Just look at the president we have now. It's all about status. There's also something else. We'll talk about it. A niche. Anybody know what a niche is?
Is it established like environment where an animal lives not considered its niche?
Right. So it's a place, let's say, where an organism lives, and it's also, you might say, it's kind of job. So if you go into the world today, there will be lawyers, there will be doctors, there will be men who stay home and watch their kids, all kinds of different things. You might say those are their niches. They usually go to a certain place to do those jobs. And so, like the classroom niche right here, I would say the niche up front is probably slightly different. Well, you can see why some people in the back might say, well, I don't really want to be up close because it's too dangerous, because I might ask you something, right? So you kind of retire in the back. Others want to be good students, and so they're going to sit right up front and bother me all the time, right? Each of those students has a kind of a niche. Not only a place where they sit, but how they interact with me as well. So a niche is a concept in ecology. There's all kinds of niches, right? You might say a coyote is a mesocarnivore. It probably has a den at a certain place, maybe, especially if it has pups. It makes its living in a certain way. Okay, now, if you remember from evolution, you can't say, oh, what is evolution? It's one thing. No, it's a very, very broad subject. It can be evolution in terms of the fossil record. It can be examples of evolution right now, where selection is going on, and certain variants are doing better than others. Okay? Well, in ecology, there's a whole bunch of different areas of ecology. One of them is called behavioral ecology. And that's exactly what it sounds like. Now, there are all kinds of behaviors. In fact, right now, I think I see a lot of this going on, including myself. So that's fine. Anyway, there are different kinds of behaviors, and there are different types of behaviors. And they vary along, like, certain axes. So there are some behaviors that are innate. We don't have to learn them, right? Yawning is one of them. Smiling to a certain extent. Let's see. You know, babies with their sucking motion, no one has to teach them to grab onto a nipple and start sucking away, right? That's an innate behavior. There are also behaviors that are highly modified. In other words, they're affected by the environment and learning, let's say. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be conscious learning. It can also be like a baby puts his hand on a hot stove, gets burned. The next time it comes in contact with a hot stove, it's going to stay away, right? Like it might learn the fear response. Fear response is not necessarily conscious at all. Okay? Now, language acquisition. Actually, I would say that language, certainly learning, but also very much innate at the same time. We have all these structures in our brain, and we have the way our mouth and our throat is the configuration so that we can make a whole bunch of different kinds of sounds. So there has to be a certain innate thing involved there in terms of learning. If you didn't have the right brain structures, well, you'd have no language, okay? And then language, of course, we don't learn it all at once. We usually learn it when we're a little baby, slowly but surely over time. There's what's called a critical period. Same kind of critical period that birds, when they're learning song from their fathers, there's a critical period there. Sometimes there's instances where you don't want a learning period. I think I mentioned, what was it? Let's say a monster comes in here. You don't want to sit here thinking, what should I do? You're going to have one of two responses. You're going to freeze in place because you're absolutely terrified, or you're going to lose your mind and try to run away, okay? You don't want to have to think about what you should do in a really, really, really dangerous situation. You don't have time for thinking. There are something called fixed action patterns. That's a highly innate behavior. A fixed action pattern is like the baby. Doesn't have to be taught to suck. It's a natural sucking response. It's born with it. It's stimulated by that big round nipple that it sees, and it knows, oh, I'm hungry, and that's where I'm going, okay? But it's not necessarily thinking of that. It's just a fixed action pattern. It does it over and over again the exact same way. It doesn't have to be taught. There are all kinds of different communication. A lot of communication between organisms goes on at a chemical level. Okay? Some at a visual level, some at an auditory level, some at the level of smells. Well, that's mainly a chemical. Things like that. So, if you also look along this axis, you see over here, haliostereotype fixed. That means there's no variation. Usually over here means there's not much learning going on. And then over here on this side, we have highly flexible learning or highly flexible behavior that might need to be practiced over and over and over again. Some things start out one way and then become another. So a little baby is not very, well, let's see. He's kind of all over the place, right? That's because its body is learning how to move in the proper way. Eventually, it'll get to the point where it can stand up and start walking around, all that. Until, of course, finally, people don't even think about when they're walking, okay, or whether they should stand up or not. I mean, they may decide, but for the most part, it becomes almost a stereotype thing where you don't have to think about it anymore, okay? So these things are not necessarily, there's a continuum, and some of them are always going to be the same way in terms of behavior and over and over and over again. And then in other cases, it's going to be like a learned sort of thing. Oh. Let's see here. Okay, so that's one of the behavioral ecology sort of things. Now, this animal not only uses camouflage to hide from predators, but also from prey, right? So prey comes along, they see this blob that's, let's say, looking like coral, and they don't realize it's actually an octopus. So you can use camouflage for a whole bunch of different things. In other words, animals, they use deception, basically. We do too. Now, kind of at the basic level is something called organismal ecology. That means looking at the whole organism, physiology, anatomy. So why, in fact, it behaves the way it does is partly because of the way it's shaped and what it's designed to do. So we have a little antelope ground squirrel here that's designed, well, it's pretty well adapted to the desert. It lives in a very dry environment. It's out during the day, not at night. Now, I'm showing this plant here because this animal is very, very interested in the fruits that are on this plant. Okay, so we have an interaction between that animal and these fruits. No, come on. There we go. Is that helping? Well, anyway, you can see. This is called desert peach. One of the things that I did when I did a PhD was I wanted to know who was dispersing the seeds for this plant. Okay, and I found out there's no animals that actually eat the whole fruit. It's not very palatable. But at a certain point, it's called desert peach. It's related to the peaches, but not like the ones so much in Asia. It's been a long time since they've been separated. It's more like an almond. And most almond-like species of this group, called prunus, live in arid environments. And instead of relying on like a frugivore to come along and eat the fruit and then poop it out somewhere else for seed dispersal, this plant actually relies on this little guy. And what this guy does is he caches food. So not only can this animal actually live in a very dry environment, it's also got an amazing spatial memory. It can remember exactly where it buried all these different things. Okay? So that means its brain structure is pretty, what is it? Well, it's pretty highly evolved for that specific task. We were just looking at octopus. Much of their brain is dedicated to visual stuff, and then controlling all that other stuff that's going on in terms of texture and visuals and all that kind of thing in terms of camouflage. Well, for this animal, it's absolutely vital that it remember where it put things. Okay? If it doesn't, then it would bury something, it would forget it, it wouldn't be able to come back and recover it. Because it can only eat a certain amount at any one time. Human beings do the same sort of thing. Just to think about the people who are hoarders. Now, there's different kinds of hoarding. There's central place hoarding, like a big nest. So some of these other animals are actually like that. But this one makes little caches all over the place because there's always a chance something else is going to come along and find it. Okay? It turns out this plant also relies on this animal for dispersal and germination. Because, salute.
Thank you.
If A seed doesn't get buried, it is not going to survive. It's going to dry out and die immediately. Okay? So even though this plant is in effect feeding most of its babies to this animal, there's going to be some that the animal buries that it doesn't recover. Okay? Now remember, neither side is thinking about this. Like the animal isn't thinking, well, I better bury this stuff for this plant because otherwise I won't have something to eat later on, or my offspring. No, it doesn't work like that. The plant is providing a resource. The animal uses it in its everyday job. It manages to help the plant inadvertently. And the plant does the same thing for the animal in terms of food. So, one part of ecology is population ecology. Now we've already had a little bit of that. If you think about bacteria dividing and reproducing, okay? This is the same thing as like this African plain full of wildebeest. They're reproducing at a much lower rate, but populations change over time. And they kind of follow certain laws. Let's see, I think I'll... Okay. Now, normally population growth starts out like this, and then it's exponential growth. Why wouldn't things keep growing on and on and on and on like this forever? Anybody? So let's say you have a population of wildebeest or elephants or bacteria. Would you just expecting the population to get bigger and bigger and bigger over time? No. And why? Predators? Exactly. What else? Nutrients. Exactly. So, usually there's something where the population is going to hit a point where, let's say there's not enough food. Or a population might grow and predators might eat it, and then because there's so much to eat, they're going to start producing more and more predators, and so they're going to put a top on it as well. Okay? So we never see anything where something is going to keep growing forever. Yes?
What about that one population in Australia, the rabbits, when they let them loose and it kept growing?
Right. So, anybody in here like bunny rabbits? Okay. When the English colonized Australia, well, a lot of them were actually convicts. They put them over there. But there were some English who went there, and they pined for their old English countryside, right? And one of the things in the English countryside is rabbits. So they released some rabbits. And rabbits breed like rabbits. And pretty much soon, the whole countryside was literally covered in rabbits. There are no real predators of them, dingoes, but not much. And there was very little plants left to graze for native wildlife or for their sheep, whatever. So they looked at an ecological solution to the rabbits. They actually brought in this deadly virus and released it. And it destroyed the rabbit population, about 99% of it, but some survived. And then over time, both sides kind of evolved in terms of the rabbits and the virus. And so now the rabbits have built up a certain amount of immunity, and the viruses have attenuated in terms of the virulence that they have. And so now there's kind of an uneasy coexistence where the virus kills about 30 or 40% instead of 99%. Okay, so yeah.
You know how bananas are like depleting like crazy? I think they're dying out.
Yeah, they're being infected by I think it's a fungus or something like that.
Are they gonna build tolerance to it, or are they just gonna go extinct?
They're trying. Right now, they're in search of a different variety instead of the Cavendish.
Oh, okay.
So the Cavendish is what we're all used to. There's actually thousands of different varieties of bananas. Some of you know about, like fried bananas, plantains, those sorts of things. The Cavendish, they like it like most industrial agriculture because you can harvest it before it's ripe. You can transport it without it getting bruised, and then it'll ripen when you want it to. Doesn't mean it necessarily has the best taste. There are a lot of other bananas that are much nicer, actually. But same sort of thing. So, in fact, right now they're racing to try to develop another variety that's actually resistant to this pathogen. Now, there's something else called community ecology. A community involves a whole bunch of organisms that live in the same place. So we had organismal ecology, an individual organism. We've had behavioral ecology, where organisms interact with each other or by themselves. And then community ecology is where all the living things in the environment interact. So here we have what's actually called a food web. And a food web involves, first of all, at the lowest level, we have grass. Okay, those are primary producers. A lot of things eat grass. We have in the background pronghorn antelope, buffalo, mice. We've also got and don't forget the insects and secondary consumers, right, of the grass. And then we have things that eat those secondary consumers. And for example, number 3 is this bird and meadowlark that's eating that insect. Let's see, where is, I guess sometimes, well, be better if it was a wolf that ate the bison or the pronghorn antelope, or it might be a hawk. That's the 3rd tier. There can often even be a 4th tier. In this case, we've got a vulture that's going to eat things after they're killed. Oh, God. Okay, now. There are a number of different what are called trophic levels. In this case, there's a 4 trophic level system. There are a bunch of other systems that are much more evolved, complex. There's some that are very, very simple. We talked a little bit about niches. So each of these organisms has a niche. This mouse lives in this kind of prairie. It also has a burrow that it probably stays in at night, or no, in the daytime, because it's nocturnal. So part of its niche is this nocturnal omnivore, because it eats a lot of things. Besides just seeds, it also eats insects and things like that. And so community ecology is the structure of a place where all the organisms that live in it, including the plants, the animals, the fungi, the bacteria that break things down, all those kinds of things are part of the community ecology of some place. This is a fairly simple community, but if you went to the, let's say, the lowland tropics in South America, there's a lot more individual types of animals and plants, and the interactions that are going on there are much more complex as well. So communities can be really simple or very complex or anywhere in between. Now, when you start adding in what's called the abiotic environment, like we talked about it in here, the seats, the temperature, the amount of light, then you're talking about an ecosystem. And I talked about this earlier when we looked at the coral reef system. So there's more to the coral reef than just the animals that are living there and some of the bacteria. There are also the salinity of the water. Where is this environment at in terms of the water column? It's usually pretty close to the surface, so that that the zooxanthellae, for one thing, can make carbohydrates and a bunch of other stuff that's going on. So an ecosystem like this right here, we have obviously have energy from sunlight. Some of this sunlight is taken up by the trees and turned into carbohydrates. Others is actually taken up and then lost as heat. All the other things in it are taking up heat and taking up and releasing heat as well. There are all these nutrients that are involved. There's also, of course, oxygen and carbon dioxide that are cycling through this whole system in the atmosphere, plus nitrogen. And then there's all these chemical bond energy. That, let's say, in this case, when this zebra dies, there'll be fungi that are going to digest it in a sense and get energy from that. So, an ecosystem is usually a larger area, but not necessarily. You could say that our body is an ecosystem for a whole bunch of microorganisms. And, yeah.
So technically an ecosystem is all the things you need in order to survive?
What's that?
So technically an ecosystem is all the things that you need in order to survive?
Yeah, for the most part. And ecosystems vary depending on what their constituents are. Now, on the Earth, the primary ecosystem is usually photosynthetic organisms that make carbohydrates, whether they're plants, they're bacteria in the ocean. Those sorts of things are the bottom of it. And then everything is built on top of that. So you're always going to have fewer consumers than you're going to have producers. Otherwise, it would, of course, they'd eat themselves out of house and home. Now, I mentioned this. These are terrestrial ecosystems. Terrestrial means on the Earth, terra. And they're associated with certain abiotic conditions. So, that's the Sahara. Very, very dry. We've got a nice little desert out here. You go to the eastern deciduous forests, a lot wetter. Not quite as wet, though, as um, tropical forests, like down here in Brazil, in the Amazon. Something that we live in is called a Mediterranean environment. And it's also very similar to the Mediterranean, okay, from which it's named. And there are Mediterranean environments, not only the Mediterranean and the west coast of the United States and California, but also there's another one down in South Africa that's similar, and they all have they have a limited amount of precipitation. They usually get it all in the wintertime and none during the summertime. And so the plants have certain things that can deal with that, let's say, water shortage at certain times of the year. The Arctic, of course, is very cold, and it's at certain times of the year it gets a lot of sun, and other times of the year it gets none. Okay? And then a whole bunch of other stuff that we can see here, but there's more than that. But just so you have an idea of an ecosystem. So we live, like I said, in the Mediterranean ecosystem. If you start heading east from here, you'll get into a desert ecosystem. You'll finally start hitting the Rockies at a certain point. Well, no, first you'll hit the Sierras, a montane ecosystem, eventually the Rockies. Once you hit the other side of the Rockies, you're going to get into a grassland ecosystem. Some ecosystems create their own conditions, like a tropical rainforest actually controls, in many respects, the amount of rainfall there is. Because there's so much, it's warm, and there's so much water being evaporated away from the plants that they create clouds, dense clouds, that then cause big downpours. Okay. Now there's also something called conservation biology, which what it kind of does is it's an applied ecology. As its name suggests, is conserving, let's say, natural ecosystems. You have basic biological sciences over here, population and conservation biology in here, and then applied management like wildlife, agriculture, range science. These are all the things that make up conservation biology. We do a fair amount of it in this country. We tend to protect our environments. Other places don't. They just don't have the wherewithal. There's oftentimes too many people. So you go to some places, let's say Madagascar, and there's hardly any vegetation left. They grow rice. It didn't used to be that way, of course, but their population has exploded. Now, we've talked a little bit about biogeography before. Why are organisms found where they are? And how does, first of all, there's abiotic factors. These wolves in, let's say, the arboreal forests of northern Canada, they've got a long fur coat. They've got a whole bunch of things that allow them to survive there. They would not do very well in a tropical rainforest, would they? Okay. Part of the reason we remember, if you remember, is that organisms are found where they are, not just ecologically, but because of historical factors. So This is one of the ratites, kind of like let's say an ostrich. This is hundreds of millions of years ago. Then as these different parts started to separate into different continents, they carried the occupants with them along. And so it looks like now we have ratites, rheas in South America, ostriches in Africa, plus elephant birds that are extinct, emus, and moas in Australia and New Zealand, and also cassowaries. Okay? Yeah?
What about penguins found in the rainforest?
They're not.
I have seen them. There's like a book I read that like little weird feathers.
Penguins?
Yes, like a penguin with like species.
No.
Maybe I read a fake part.
It was a fake article. Yeah, penguins are completely aquatic, well, for the most part. I mean, they get out on land, let's say ice floes and things like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no,
Alright.
they would not do well in the rainforest.
Let's say that. Is that true?
They'd be kind of like a little walking box lunch, okay, for a predator like a leopard. Okay, oh, so you know, let's see, what was that? It's hard to say. I think this is actually a praying mantis, but anyway. Okay, so biogeography in terms of why things are the way they are, it's abiotic tolerances, the animals and plants that already live there, that you're interacting with, and history. Okay, now, as I mentioned, the basis for all life on the planet are usually photosynthetic organisms. Now, that's not entirely true. There are some things that are called chemosynthetic organisms that do the same sorts of things, but they do it with chemical reactions and not photosynthetic chemical reactions. So, plants have what are called chloroplasts. They're organelles like mitochondria. And they have all these different pigments for intercepting different wavelengths of light. And they turn and absorb these different wavelengths, and they turn them into, along with carbon dioxide, into long carbon compounds like carbohydrates. So essentially, plants fix carbon in the ecosystem. The same sort of thing happens in the ocean, except that there are really not many plants in the ocean. There are algae like big kelp forests and things like that also do photosynthesis. Mainly, there's a lot of bacteria in the ocean that do most of it. So this is the basis for most of the food that we all eat. Whether it gets, it stays that way as a plant that we eat, or it gets turned into an animal that eats it, that then we then eat. Okay. In the simplest form, we have CO2. Oops. We have H2O. We have sunlight energy. And then, in terms of what's given off later on, well, we've got basically a carbohydrate and oxygen. So, photosynthetic organisms give oxygen for all the rest of us consumers. Now, glucose metabolism kind of reverses this process, if you remember. So we start out with this carbohydrate. We use oxygen to oxidize it. We break these chemical bonds, and in the end, we end up with CO2, water, like what we started with. And then we have a whole bunch of ATP, which is the energy component of the currency, and heat. And heat is basically wasted energy. So sunlight, photosynthesis, sugars and oxygen, carbon dioxide and water, and a lot of energy. Okay, so why is it building up in the atmosphere? Well, one of the reasons, of course, is we're pumping a lot of it into the atmosphere. Anytime, let's say you cut down a forest and you burn it, you're releasing lots of carbon dioxide. Anytime you're burning fossil fuels, you're releasing a lot of carbon dioxide. Every time you breathe, you're releasing carbon dioxide. Every time a cow farts, it's releasing a big cloud of methane, and methane is another greenhouse gas. Okay? So normally what happens is that all this carbon that's sitting out in there in terms of carbon dioxide, a lot of it gets taken up, of course, by plants, and then turn it back into carbon-based compounds. But, and there's kind of a balance. But we're burning so much fossil energy that we're kind of overwhelming the system. So that's why we actually have what's called global warming going on. And you can see it mostly in the Arctic right now and the Antarctic. Water levels are going to rise. I would imagine in 100 years, much of the Gulf Coast is going to be underwater. Florida, New York City, that sort of stuff. It's getting warmer and warmer, holds more water in the atmosphere. So all kinds of things are going on. Now, hydrocarbons like CH4, methane, you do the same thing as you do with carbon dioxide. You have oxygen, and then you release H2O, carbon dioxide, and energy. And that's what we use for a long time, what we were using for energy. Now, photovoltaics are getting to the point where they're basically equivalent in terms of price. Now, the reason that we have what's called the greenhouse effect is that we have an atmosphere. And all the sun's rays and all that energy that hits the earth doesn't necessarily bounce back off into the atmosphere and then escape into the solar system. A lot of it is heat-trapped gases. And so if you want to see an extreme greenhouse effect, go to Venus. Venus has a much thicker atmosphere. The terrestrial temperature is about 900 degrees. I think Celsius, I'm pretty sure, very, very hot. Okay, so that really has a greenhouse. The effect of greenhouse gases has changed over time depending on what's in the atmosphere. So, global warming, part of climate change. Climates have always changed. But most of the data at this point shows that the increase in CO2 from our burning of fossil fuels is increasing the greenhouse effect and raising worldwide temperatures. That doesn't mean it's always going to be warmer in places. Sometimes it'll be colder in the wintertime. Yeah?
Wasn't it getting warmer either way, like 10,000 years ago, prior to like 1500s? It was
Okay,
getting
so
warmer regardless.
the end of the last ice age,
Yeah.
10,000 years ago, was very cold, it warmed up.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, there have always been things like that. The thing is, the Earth's orbit is not circular, okay? And It's elliptical, but it also changes over time. And we're actually in a cycle now where we should be cooling down a little bit, okay? Instead, we're warming up. So now there's been other times when we're in a cycle where you're warming up. And then if that was happening right now, we'd say, well, you could plausibly say that a lot of it is just because of the natural cycle. But in this case, it's the evidence is really, really strong. Now, it's not strong in terms of individual events. Like this flood is because of global warming. It's trend lines and temperature. And so, okay. Okay, so we have temperatures, let's say, and this is years, right? Let's say this is the 1900s, 2000s, right? And it looks like in terms of temperature, it's been rising. Now, there was, let's see, 600 years ago, no, 1200, so that's about 800 years ago, there was a big warming trend that was going on in the southwest deserts. And in fact, it was probably the cause of the Anasazi moving because there wasn't enough water, okay? So it was very dry, it was a long, long drought. So temperature does change, but in this case, we've got a lot of evidence that it's global warming. Okay, so this is what it looks like in terms of carbon dioxide. There's other reasons for carbon dioxide to get into the atmosphere, along with some other stuff like volcanism, things like that. Okay. There have been, so you can see temperature in blue, carbon dioxide in red. There's a correlation there. And it's actually cause and effect because CO2 traps heat within the atmosphere. And you can see that in the past, at certain times, it's been very, very warm naturally on the planet. This is what it was like. That was probably the end of the Ice Age, but this big spike here is all recent. I think that's it. Okay. Oops.